All right, last video on the skin. So we're going to get into the derivatives of the skin, which means all the accessory organs. We're going to talk about mainly hair and nails. So we'll talk about hair, what is it, how does it grow, disorders, and then we'll get into things like oil glands, sebum glands, and then talk about nails. So hairs, what are hairs? It's just basically a bunch of packed together dead keratinized epithelial cells that have just been flattened out, which means they're pretty much just dried keratin. There's like almost nothing else there except for dried keratin. And we see these all over pretty much the entire body, right? The only places we really don't see them are going to be on like your palms, the bottom of your feet, your lips, and right around the urogenital orifices, or right around the urethra, right, and the vagina, right? We'll see it around it, but like right up close to it, they'll start to disappear. So mostly everywhere, right? Even on your forehead, even on your cheeks, right? Your arms, right? Everywhere has hair, even though it might be very fine. And there's a few main parts to the hair. We have the hair shaft. This is what you see when you see hair. We have the hair root, which is down below. And then the bulb, which is going to have the matrix cells that basically help build that hair. So if you were to pull a single hair out, right, and you were to you could see all of these components, right, if you pulled a hair out to the root. So you get the hair shaft, which is what you pulled on, the root, which is the end of the hair, and then the bulb, which would be that clearish portion that would surround the root. Now, these guys are going to get their nourishment basically from the capillaries that are around the dermal papillae to kind of nourish and make the matrix cells happy. Just right below that, we do see melanocytes, which will make the melanin that gets taken up by the matrix cells when we build the hair. So this is what would give your hair color. The hair follicle is going to be just that opening. It's like this little sac, this little extension of the epidermis, right, where the hair kind of extends through. And then attached to these hairs, we have a sebaceous gland, which will empty into the hair follicle. So they'll produce things like oils and whatnot. And so this is like when your hair gets oily, you haven't washed it in a while, it's the sebaceous glands pushing oil into the hair follicle, which then travels down the hair shaft. Now there's different types of hair, right? Because you think about your own body, you have probably longer hair, more obvious hair on your head, maybe facial hair, right? And then specific patterns of body hair when it comes to male versus female, right, based on sex hormones. Terminal hairs are going to be the coarse hairs. This is what you think of when you think of hair. So the hair on your head, or if you have a beard, right, these are terminal hairs. These can reach long lengths, right? If you've ever seen someone who's really grown their hair out, it can be several feet long. It can be, I mean, some people have grown their hair out all the way down to the floor, right? So these can get really long. Body hair is a special case of terminal hairs that grow in response to androgens. These don't typically grow the same way like your scalp hair does, right? Or the beard hair. Vellus hairs is your peach fuzz. So no matter where you look on the body, you're going to have peach fuzz. These little tiny hairs, right, that are just barely visible, really, really fine. If someone's exposed to androgens, these can convert to terminal hairs though. And then lastly, we get to lanugo. This is usually this really fine, really soft hair. This is what we think of neonates. It can occur in people with anorexia nervosa, but typically we think of lanugo with brand new newborn babies, right? This does have a function. It helps anchor the vernix caseosa, this like cheesy like substance, to the fetus. And this soon falls off, right? This does not hang around forever and will dissipate. So if you're like, oh my gosh, this baby, what the heck's going on? That lanugo generally will just fall out. Now, hair grows in a cycle. There's 3 parts. There's the anagen, the catagen, and the telogen phases. So in the anagen phase, we are actively growing. We're looking at about 0.4 millimeters a day, and this can last several years, right? After several years, we go into catagen, which is the stop period, which basically is a few weeks where we just don't do anything. And then telogen is the rest period, about 3 months, where the follicle atrophies, we're cut off from the blood supply, and then eventually that hair is lost. Um, Most people lose about 50 to 100 hairs a day, right? And then they'll be replaced. So after the telogen phase, we can restart. The matrix in the bulb will cause the follicles to mature again and enter the anagen phase, and then it starts all over again, right? We go through all of these. There are defects that can lead to baldness, like male pattern baldness, but also hormonal things, different conditions that can lead to us entering telogen phases too early, or maybe we get stuck in telogen phase, or we are just, for whatever reason, or an autoimmune disorder where the hair follicles are actually attacked, like in alopecia. So the one most common is what we call androgenetic alopecia. This is male pattern balding is what we usually call it, because most of the time we're thinking of men who experience this. So this is super common, right? It's super common, especially in men, but it can also impact women, usually a combination of genetics and environmental exposures, but usually we're looking at people over 40. That being said, with men, this can start relatively early. So some people do experience this as soon as their teens or even 20s. But the extreme side of it is usually like a little bit older. So this is, we usually get a pattern to it. So it's characteristic to start losing it at the temples that kind of recede back to form like this M shape. So rather than have a hairline that kind of goes straight across the forehead, it starts to form an M where you have two kind of peaks moving backwards towards the back of the head. In females, this is called female pattern baldness. This is where the hair becomes thinner everywhere, so you don't see that patterning. It's kind of a total loss overall, and this is usually, this can be common with certain conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome. Polycystic ovary syndrome, there's some overlap with typically male characteristics coming into play with PCOS. So hirsutism can be a feature as well of PCOS, meaning we have a hair patterning that mimics more of a male pattern rather female. So someone with hirsutism would have an overgrowth of hair, all things considered. So this person would maybe have facial hair even though they were born and identify as female. Keratosis pilaris, this is also super common where the hair follicles get like this, it's almost like a little rash, these little bumps. It's common on the upper arms, the thighs, the cheeks, and the buttocks. This is just because of an abnormal exfoliation of the hair follicle. So we get an accumulation of that keratin, which causes a blockage in the follicle, which causes a bump. And so a lot of times a chemical exfoliant is used to help minimize this. Next, we get to the skin glands. So we have like sebaceous glands. These are the ones that produce that oily sebum. They're connected to the hair follicles, and we see them pretty much everywhere. And then the pseudoauriferous, or the sweat glands. We have two types, the eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine sweat glands are the ones we find pretty much everywhere, super numerous, and we don't see them associated with hair follicles. It's also the sweat that tends to not really do much in terms of like body odor. The body odor is typically coming from the other one, which is the apocrine sweat gland. This is associated with hair follicles, and we find them pretty much focused in two areas, the axillary or the armpit region and the pubic region. And so these ones, when you think of like body odor, this is usually what you're thinking. You're thinking of the apocrine sweat glands. And it's because the type of sweat produced can be a little different. Eccrine focus on more of a water-based kind of basic sweat, versus apocrine has more organic substances in it that bacteria really enjoy. The mammary glands, this is a modified sweat gland basically, that instead of producing sweat, we produce milk, right? They can become inflamed where you get mastitis. Ceruminous glands, these are the ones that produce your earwax, or cerumen. And then meibomian glands, this is what you get in your eyelids, so that basically it gets dispersed over your eye to limit evaporation and spillage of tears. Sebaceous glands, the ones connected to hair follicles, we find them everywhere except on the thick skin. They are going to produce sebum, and that helps to condition and moisturize the skin. So oil, right, production, sebum production is not a bad thing. It is something that will help provide some protection to the skin, some moisturizing features to the skin. There are some, when it comes to things like sweat and oil, there are some antimicrobial properties to it. So you have a natural built-in antimicrobial property to the components that are pushed onto the surface of your skin. So in those, we find things like triglycerides, cholesterol, wax esters, squalene, fatty acids. We do see that these glands also produce the vernix caseosa, which is this waxy, cheesy substance that protects the skin in utero. And then sebocytes, which are basically going to be the ones that produce this. From there, we have a duct that will carry the sebum from the gland up to the surface of the skin, right, which will open up through the hair follicle. Now, sometimes these can get blocked, and this is where we develop something called acne vulgaris. It's a super common disorder. I mean, pretty much everyone has had acne at some point. Severity can range, but most people have had a pimple or something like that at some point in their life. But basically what this is you have a clogged pore, right, a clogged hair follicle with a non-inflammatory has a non-inflammatory open or a closed comedone. So basically it can be fully open or it can be closed. Right? Usually we see like then this inflammation that occurs, and that's where you see like the pimple. So you can have like a comedone, which is just like there is a clogged pore, right? We see that there it is clogged of some sort, right? Where we have accumulated the keratin, accumulated the sebum, and then it can become inflamed. Right? And that's where we think of like, oh, I have a pimple, right? Because we now see like there's the redness, we see that pressure being built up. Sometimes these can actually be painful because the pressure they put on nerve endings and whatnot around them. A lot of times we see this on the face, we see these on the neck, on the back, the chest, and the upper arms are the most common things. A lot of causes for this, but I mean there's no single one cause of acne. There's a lot of things that go into it. If we look at some of the causes, someone with polycystic ovarian disorder or PCOS, they have a tendency to have more acne. Exposure to hormones can cause acne, so that's why certain like birth control pills can help with acne because we're regulating hormonal levels. Diet. Sometimes some people think, some people have found that if they cut certain things out of their diet or limit things like milk or high glycemic index foods, that it helps them. Androgens. So again, this is where that hormone part comes in. And it's also why acne tends to pop up around puberty when hormone levels are wildly changing. And then exposure to bacteria, right? C. acnes, which can cause bacteria. If you'll notice on this list, though, we do not say that someone's skin is dirty. That's a common misconception that someone who doesn't wash their face gets acne. Actually, one of the issues that people have is overwashing the face can cause acne because the oils produced by the skin do have a natural antimicrobial component. By overwashing or using too harsh of a face wash, they can strip that antimicrobial component away. And then that allows bacteria to kind of come in that normally would not be able to capitalize on the skin. So there's a lot of things that go into acne production, and finding the root reason of why a person has acne is going to really be the one thing that helps them find a solution to it. Moving on to sweat glands, we talked about them briefly, the eccrine versus apocrine. Again, eccrine, we find it all over the place. They just go right out onto the skin surface, and they're going to be secreting, these water-based sweat that generally has maybe some electrolytes and whatnot, but not a whole lot of crazy stuff in there. So it's not the sweat we would associate with like body odor. This is just to help us regulate body temperature. Whereas the apocrine sweat glands, we generally find these in the groin, the genital area, the axilla, which is the armpits, and whatnot, this is going to be emptying onto a hair follicle. This is going to be excreting things like all the things we saw above, as well as biological or organics like the lipids and the proteins, which bacteria will consume. And this is the byproducts from the bacteria is what gives that body odor its distinct smell, right? So we're thinking apocrine sweat glands when we think of body odor. So another thing that can happen is malaria. This is heat rash. This is when the eccrine sweat glands are kind of disordered, right? So you get small itchy papules because there's an obstruction in the sweat gland, which is usually because we've been exposed to high humidity or high heat and we've been sweating a lot. So heat rash is something that just develops in response because we've been sweating so much, or we've been exposed to so much liquid that like in the humidity and whatnot, that the glands, the ducts have actually become blocked. And then hidradenitis suppurativa, this is a common chronic inflammatory condition. Basically, the apocrine glands get nodules and abscesses, so it leads to pitting and scarring. This is common with certain things, like if someone has African ethnicity, if they are taking lithium, if they have diabetes, certain thyroid disorders, dyslipidemia, if they're a smoker, right? This doesn't mean you'll get it, but they're at a higher risk. This is something that can be treated. Sometimes things get excised out or they get drained. There are some other things that can be done as well that are a little bit more invasive. Moving on to nails. Nails are going to be just kind of like a hair, but even more compacted, so they're even harder. It's dead, it's keratinized epidermal cells, just mostly keratin, right? And so if we look at the components, we have the free edge. This is the end of your nail that grows kind of off your fingertips. This grows at about 1 to 3 millimeters a month. So a significant amount of your nails can grow. The nail body, which is going to be what's kind of over your fingertip, right? So over the on your finger itself, at the very end of it, where your nail kind of reaches the edge on your finger, that's where you have that little half moon, that little white half moon called the lunula. And this is going to be at the base where the matrix cells are at. So the matrix cells are down below that, and they're the ones building new nail. So the nail body is extending out from like the cuticle and whatnot, and then the free edge is what comes off of your fingertip. The nail root, this is going to be embedded into that epidermis called the eponychium, also known as your cuticle. The nail matrix, again, is deep down there. It's the one building new nail. And then the hyponychium, this is going to be, if you look on the very bottom of the nail, so if you were to look at like your fingertips, like your fingerprints, and you look at where your nail's extending past your finger, look at where your nail, that first place you can see where your nail connects to the skin, that's the hyponychium. It's what's going to help kind of anchor your nail to your finger, right, at the very tip, at the very end. So things that can happen to the nails, you can lose a nail, right? You have a trauma, you smash your finger in a door frame, whatever. This can cause the nail to fall off because it's been loosened from the nail bed. This can cause damage to the matrix cells, and if you damage the matrix cells, this can lead it to grow kind of different than it used to. So it can grow with maybe a wave in it, or it can grow thicker or whatever because of damage. Onycholysis, this is where you separate the nail from the nail bed. Again, usually trauma. So if you hit your nail in something, you damage it in some way because of trauma, you'll see that the nail becomes like white, and that's just because you can see where the nail has separated from the skin underneath. Onychomycosis, this is a fungal infection. So when someone gets toenail fungus, right, something like that, you see a yellowing and a thickening of the nail, and this can be treated in various ways. It can be treated topically with some sort of cream or liquid, or it can be treated with oral medications depending on the type and depending on the severity. Pitting can occur. That we see this with like psoriasis. Clubbing of the nails, we see that rounding out. We see associated with certain lung and heart diseases. We can see a splinter hemorrhage. This is little tiny blood clots This is related to endocarditis. Terry's nails, where the nail plate is turned white. Murex lines, these are these horizontal bands. Bowes lines, which are indentations because the growth has been interrupted. So that can show us like, hey, you had a severe injury or illness or chemotherapy or malnutrition or something significant has happened, and then that line will grow out. So it's like almost like a mark of like, hey, at this point in your life you had this significant thing happen, and then the nail will continue to grow, and then the Bowes line would disappear as you outgrow and trim the nail. And then spooning, right, we see it's kind of like divoting inward. That can be from anemia. So I don't expect you to remember all these. Do not think you have to memorize all these. But one thing to kind of take away from this slide is that the fingernails and the toenails, right, the nails can tell us some information about a person's health. And we see like there's certain things that are actually closely associated with particular conditions, right? So it's something to pay attention to, right? If you notice, especially like the clubbing, lines, right? Things like spooning, right? Changes to the shape, the color of the nail, that can tell us about specific conditions a person may have.